In the heart of a small, fog-drenched town, Anna walked past a peculiar antique store. Its windows were dusty, its doors creaked eerily, and its sign hung crookedly, almost as if it was waiting for someone. Inside, an overwhelming scent of old wood and mothballs filled the air, and the faint sound of a ticking clock echoed in the silence. Among the collection of forgotten treasures, her eyes fell on a large, ornate mirror that stood at the back of the shop. The reflection it cast seemed wrong, as if it captured a world just a little off-kilter from her own. The store owner, an elderly man with a crooked smile, approached Anna as she stared at the mirror. "Ah, you found it," he said with an eerie calmness. "This one has a story, you know. A curse passed down through generations." Anna felt a chill creep down her spine, but the mirror's allure was too strong to resist. She reached out to touch the glass, feeling the cold surface beneath her fingertips, as the room seemed to grow darker around her. That evening, Anna placed the mirror in her apartment, not fully understanding why she was so drawn to it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she noticed a strange shift in the atmosphere. The shadows in the room deepened, and the mirror, once harmless, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, her own face, but with eyes that were hollow and distant. Shuddering, she turned away, but the image lingered in her mind. The next morning, Anna woke up to find the mirror slightly askew. As she approached it, she heard a soft whisper emanating from the glass, like a voice calling her name. "Anna?" The voice was faint but unmistakable, sending a shiver down her spine. She backed away, heart racing, but the whisper persisted, growing louder. "Come closer. I can show you what you seek." Days passed, and Anna became increasingly obsessed with the mirror. One evening, while she gazed into its depths, she saw a shadow move in the reflection, a figure that wasn't her own. It was tall, slender, and had eyes that gleamed with malice. Anna spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving only her reflection staring back at her. Anna researched the mirror's origins, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. It had once belonged to a wealthy family whose members mysteriously vanished, one by one, after each had gazed into its cursed depths. The mirror had become a vessel, trapping souls within its reflection, feeding on their fear. The more she learned, the more Anna realized that she was trapped in the same cycle. She could feel the mirror calling to her, pulling her in. The mirror's influence began to extend beyond its frame. The room seemed darker, even during the day. The air grew thick and oppressive, and the once cozy apartment now felt suffocating. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was no longer confined to the mirror. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, as if the mirror was leaking darkness into the room. Time began to lose its meaning. Hours would slip away as Anna found herself staring at the mirror, unable to break free. Some nights she'd wake up in front of it, her body stiff and her mind clouded, as if she'd been in a trance. Each time she looked into the mirror, it seemed to show a different version of her, a version that was older, her skin cracked and her eyes hollow, staring back with an eerie emptiness. One night, as she gazed into the mirror, Anna saw something horrifying. Her own reflection, but it wasn't her anymore. The figure in the glass grinned at her, its eyes black and lifeless. It spoke in a guttural voice, "You belong to me now." Anna screamed, but her own voice was swallowed by the glass. The reflection stepped out of the frame, and Anna could feel cold fingers brushing her skin. Panicking, Anna grabbed the mirror and hurled it to the ground. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards scattering across the room. But even in pieces, the mirror seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. From the shards, Anna could still see the reflection of that twisted version of herself, moving, lurking within the broken fragments. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the curse couldn't be destroyed. It was already inside her. The next day, the broken pieces of the mirror had mysteriously reassembled themselves. It stood before Anna once again, whole and gleaming, as if it had never been shattered. A dark energy radiated from the glass, and Anna felt the presence of the entity more strongly than ever. The whispers in the air had grown louder, and the shadow in the reflection had become bolder, watching her every move with malicious intent. Anna's mind began to fray. The mirror's curse took hold of her more each day. She could no longer tell where her own thoughts ended and the whispers from the mirror began. Her once vibrant apartment now felt like a prison, with the glass watching her every move. The boundaries between her world and the one inside the mirror were becoming increasingly blurred, and she could hear the faintest whispers calling her to step into it. One evening, Anna stood in front of the mirror, her reflection now completely consumed by the darkness. The voice in the mirror beckoned her, telling her she could finally escape if she just stepped through. But as she reached out, Anna knew that stepping into the reflection meant surrendering herself completely to the curse. She had no choice but to choose: face the darkness or be devoured by it. Anna stepped through the mirror, and the world around her shifted. She found herself in a cold, desolate version of her own apartment, the walls cracked and decaying. Her reflection stood before her, grinning, eyes black and empty. She realized too late that she was trapped inside the cursed realm, now just another soul doomed to haunt the mirror for eternity. The cycle had begun again. The shopkeeper's voice echoed in Anna's mind, telling her that the mirror had claimed another victim. The next day, a new person would walk into that antique shop, drawn by the same eerie allure, and the cycle would continue. Anna's face now stared back at them from the mirror, eyes hollow, forever a part of the curse. No one would ever know she had once been human. It was an unseasonably warm autumn morning when Jake received the letter. It was simple, handwritten on old parchment and sealed with a dark red wax emblem he didn't recognize. The invitation read, "Come to the Whispering Pines, the forest that hears." Intrigued and somewhat amused, Jake packed his bags, eager for a new adventure. He didn't know that this forest had been waiting for someone like him for centuries. Jake arrived at the edge of the forest as dusk began to settle. The trees were tall, their trunks wide and gnarled, and the air was thick with the smell of pine. As he stepped closer, an eerie sound reached his ears. Soft whispers that seemed to come from every direction. He paused, looking around, but saw no one. He felt the strange sensation of being watched as he crossed the threshold of the forest. The deeper Jake ventured into the forest, the louder the whispers grew. At first, they were faint, like distant voices carried on the wind. But soon they grew clear and distinct. "Come closer," "We've been waiting?" The words were soft but insistent, curling around his ears like tendrils. It felt as if the trees themselves were speaking to him, urging him forward. By the time Jake reached the heart of the forest, the whispers had turned into muffled murmurs. It was then that he noticed something unusual. There was no sound of wildlife. No birds, no rustling leaves, only silence except for the whispering voices. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond his sight. The air around him grew heavy, and an icy chill crawled down his spine. Suddenly, the trees in front of Jake shifted. Their bark seemed to shimmer like glass, reflecting his own image back at him. As he stepped closer, the reflections warped, showing not just his face, but distorted, shadowy versions of himself. His heart raced, and he instinctively stepped back. The forest was changing, and it felt as if it was responding to his every move. Through the trees, Jake saw a figure standing in the distance, a tall woman dressed in dark, flowing clothes. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with eyes that seemed too dark to be human. She didn't move, only stared at him, her presence sending a wave of unease through his body. Before he could call out, she disappeared into the woods, vanishing without a trace. But the whispers grew louder, urging him to follow. Jake followed the whispers deeper into the forest, but the path seemed to twist and change with every step. The trees grew tighter, their branches clawing at him, forcing him to push through thick underbrush. It felt as if the forest was alive, reshaping itself to trap him within. With every turn, the sense of direction was lost, and he realized he had no idea how far he'd walked or how to return. A cold wind picked up, carrying with it a voice that wasn't quite human. It spoke his name softly at first, then louder, its tone becoming more insistent. "Jake, Jake, you can hear us, can't you?" He froze, the blood draining from his face. The voice didn't come from a single point, but seemed to echo from every direction, as though the very trees themselves were speaking directly to him. As he pushed forward, Jake stumbled upon a clearing where the trees stood in perfect, that eerie rows. Their trunks were hollow, dark voids instead of solid wood. He could hear faint sounds coming from within them. Whispers, laughter, and something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was as if the trees were alive, waiting for something, perhaps for him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were listening to his every movement. Suddenly, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on leaves behind him. He spun around but saw no one. The whispers grew louder. The trees seemed to close in on him, and the feeling of being pursued intensified. He quickened his pace, but the footsteps followed, each step matching his own. His heart raced as he realized that something was moving with him, hidden just out of sight. As Jake stumbled through the woods, he suddenly found himself in front of an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and ivy. The air was thick with a powerful, ancient energy, and the whispers became a chant. He realized then that the forest wasn't just alive, it was aware of him. The trees had been listening all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The forest was not merely a place, but a living entity, capable of reading minds and bending reality. Jake dropped to his knees as the forest's power overwhelmed him. His thoughts, his fears, his deepest regrets, all of them were being laid bare for the forest to see. The whispers twisted into voices of those he loved, accusing him of his failures. The trees creaked and groaned, as if they were judging him, and the very ground beneath him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. He realized then that the forest demanded a price from those who dared to listen. Suddenly, the woman from before appeared again, standing silently at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes were no longer dark, but empty, hollow pits. She spoke softly, her voice echoing within his mind. "You heard the forest, Jake. Now it owns you." Before he could respond, she vanished once more, leaving him with the realization that he would never leave the forest alive. The forest had claimed him, and there was no escape. Jake's body felt heavy, as if his soul was being slowly drawn from him. The trees began to close in, their branches wrapping around him like shackles. He could hear the voices now, clear and sharp, the whispers of those who had fallen before him, forever trapped in the forest's grasp. As the darkness consumed him, he understood the true nature of the forest. It wasn't just a place, it was a prison for the cursed, a place where every listener was destined to become part of its endless, eternal chorus. The next morning, the forest was still, silent once again. The wind had died down, and the whispering was gone. The only evidence of Jake's presence was the faintest trace of footprints leading into the trees. But now, when the wind blew through the forest, there was a new voice among the whispers, faint but growing louder with each passing day. The forest that hears had claimed another, and it was waiting for the next soul to listen. Lena had always been drawn to the unusual, and when she stumbled upon an antique shop tucked in an alley, she couldn't resist exploring. The small sign above the door read, "The Dollmaker's Curiosities," in faded gold lettering. Inside, the shelves were lined with old porcelain dolls, their glass eyes following her every move. An old man with a crooked back and a deep, raspy voice greeted her. He introduced himself as Tobias, the dollmaker, and warned her that the dolls weren't just for show, they were special, with a curse. As Lena wandered through the shop, she found a peculiar doll hidden in the back corner. Its face was cracked, and the eyes, though glass, seemed oddly lifelike, gleaming under the dim light. Tobias noticed her fascination and approached. "That one," he whispered, "is different from the others. It was made by the first doll maker, my great-grandfather. It holds a dark secret." Lena, intrigued and unnerved, purchased it, unaware that this doll would soon change her life forever. That night, Lena placed the doll on her nightstand, admiring its intricate details. As the clock struck midnight, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the doll's eyes seemed to glimmer. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in her ears, low and menacing. "Return me." Lena froze, heart racing, but when she turned to look, the doll was still. Yet the air in the room felt heavier, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The next morning, Lena woke to find the doll had moved from the nightstand to the edge of her bed. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but then it happened again the next night. The doll would always be in a new position, closer to her each time. One evening, she woke to find the doll sitting on her chest, its cold, lifeless eyes staring directly into hers. The whispers returned, louder this time. "You cannot escape." Desperate and terrified, Lena returned to the shop to confront Tobias. The shop was empty, its door creaking open as she stepped inside. Tobias was nowhere to be found, but in his place was a note. "The doll is part of a curse. one that binds the soul of its owner. As she read the note, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Turning quickly, she saw nothing but the darkness of the shop. The feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, Lena researched the origins of the doll. She discovered that Tobias's great-grandfather had been rumored to practice forbidden rituals, binding spirits to his creations. The dolls were not just lifelike, they were vessels for the trapped souls of the cursed. Lena shuddered as she realized the doll she had bought was the first ever made, and it had claimed every owner before her. The curse was older than she had ever imagined. That night, Lena began to experience vivid, terrifying dreams. In each one, she found herself in a dark, cold workshop, surrounded by hundreds of dolls. They all stared at her with lifeless eyes, their mouths stitched shut. Then the first doll, her doll, would crawl toward her, its limbs twisting unnaturally. The whispers filled her mind again, demanding her to listen. She woke every morning drenched in sweat, terrified to sleep again. One night, Lena awoke to find the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its once static face now contorted into an eerie grin. It wasn't just moving anymore, it was alive. The doll began to whisper in her ear, its tiny mouth moving. "You're next." The words sent a chill through her body, and before she could scream, the doll lunged at her, but in the blink of an eye, it was back on her nightstand, still and lifeless once again. As the days passed, Lena noticed more and more dolls appearing in her apartment, each one eerily similar to the first. They were placed on shelves, tables, and even on the floor, always staring at her. The whispers grew louder, and she could hear them even when no one was around. She realized that each new doll was another piece of the curse, and there was no escaping them. The dolls were multiplying, and so was the darkness that surrounded her. Desperate for answers, Lena sought Tobias out once again. She found him at a different, crumbling house, sitting in front of a fire. Tobias explained that his great-grandfather's curse was an attempt to achieve immortality. The dolls were vessels for the souls of the deceased, and the first doll, the one Lena had, was the key to breaking the curse. But the cost was unimaginable. To destroy the doll was to sacrifice the soul of the person who owned it. Lena now faced an impossible choice. To destroy the doll meant her life would be forfeit, but leaving it alive would continue the cycle of torment and horror. The doll was growing more powerful, its whispers growing louder, and its presence more oppressive. Lena knew the only way to end it was to destroy the doll. But at what cost? The fear of her own demise consumed her, but she could no longer live with the growing terror. Lena decided to destroy the doll, and as she brought it to the fire, the whispers grew into frantic screams. "No," the doll cried. "You can't escape." But Lena, resolute, threw the doll into the flames. The room shook with a violent force as the doll burned, its glass eyes glowing until they shattered. For a moment, all was still, and then silence fell. For a brief moment, Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it was short-lived. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in her mind. There was always a price. The silence in the room grew unnerving, and Lena realized with horror that something had changed. The dolls may have been destroyed, but their curse had not been lifted. She could feel it now, a presence watching her from the shadows. Days later, Lena noticed a familiar sight, a doll sitting at the foot of her bed. It was a different doll, but its glass eyes were the same as the first. The whispers returned, and she realized with dread that the curse was far from broken. It had merely found a new vessel. Lena was trapped in a never-ending cycle, a prisoner of the Dollmaker's curse. Lena's life had become a nightmare. Every time she destroyed one doll, another would appear. The curse had outlived its creator, and now it was her burden to bear. As she walked through the streets one evening, she felt eyes on her, cold, lifeless eyes. The Dollmaker's curse had claimed her, and there was no escape. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.